Welcome back to DAZN MMA. Sean O'Connell and Dan Hardy here. And Dan, I want to talk about the one that got away. And I'm not talking about significant others. I'm talking about fights. Conversation is inspired by comments from Leon Edwards recently saying, man, I just wish I could have put a beating on Jorge Masvidal. That's the fight that Leon Edwards wants and wants back and wants an opportunity to have, but it doesn't make sense because of where he's at in his career and where Jorge Masvidal is in his career. I'm still not 100% convinced we never see something like that from these two. But for the time being, it doesn't look like it's in the cards. It doesn't look like it's a real possibility. And Leon Edwards expressed some regret on that. So it got me thinking about the best fights that we didn't get to see in mixed martial arts. The fights that got away from all of us as fans, as commentators, as people inside the sport.
I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because there are lots of greats versus greats that you would have wanted to see. I mean, there's moving of weight classes. Of course, GSP versus Anderson Silva was always a conversation. I would have loved to have seen that fight. And, to be honest, I feel like they could have found a comfortable catch weight to have agreed at, because Anderson Silva wasn't the biggest of middleweights. I mean, I think he even fought in, was it Rumble on the Rock before he joined the UFC at 80 kilos? Like, he wasn't too far. So I think that would have been a really interesting fight had we got to seen it, when they were both in their prime. But then, like, the other one that keeps coming up, like Fedor, and of course we don't want to see him keep fighting now. There's no one I would like to see him fight right now on the face of the planet, to be honest. But back in the day when he was just such a ferocious finisher in Pride, and then we had heavyweight champions over in the UFC. I always wanted to see like a Fedor versus Frank Mir or Fedor versus Randy Couture. That was my dream fight, really. I would have loved to have seen it.
That Fedor versus Randy is a fight that I remember talking about. My first job in radio was doing a once a week MMA like local show. And we talked about that when Randy was a UFC champion and Fedor was on that run, like that 19 fight win streak or whatever. And they just couldn't get it done, right? And that was kind of the glory days of the golden age of mixed martial arts, right? And you had this like mysterious, foreign-born, silent killer like Fedor, the last emperor. And then you had Captain America, Randy Couture, right? Who, against all odds and despite age and all that stuff, had just continued to have incredible success. And thankfully, I've had a chance to become friends with Randy and work with Randy in the PFL. Randy wanted that fight. Randy was desperate to make that fight happen, angled for it, tried to make it happen, tried to sue his way out of contracts so he could get that fight, and it just never came to fruition. That might be like the number one what-if fight for that era, at least. I mean, there have been since, right? There have been better heavyweights, arguably, than both of them, but those guys being either in their prime or close to their prime at the same time in different organizations. Are we ever going to get something like that again? We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, they were like the heavyweight enigmas in the two different divisions, weren't they? In the two different organizations, like Fedor was just. I mean, he was a terrifying individual, partly because his face never changed, whether he was, I don't know, waiting for a bus or punching somebody in the face. He just had this kind of blank look on his face, like he was he was like programmed to do a job. You know what I mean? And like, I would have just seen, because like the other, like Randy was always trying to push himself to challenge, to try and do other things. I mean, like when he took on Brock Lesnar, I was there live for that one, and like, I remember Randy getting into the octagon and running around in a circle and thinking to myself, oh, right, Randy Couture, one of the best heavyweights that's ever lived. And then Brock Lesnar showed up, and I thought, hang on, that looks like one of those like atomic blast safe fridges from like the 1960s. Like, how is this a fair fight? It just didn't. It didn't seem like it was even. But then Randy and Fedor, I felt like they were both of a similar size, but had the similar kind of respect within the sport. Like it would have been an amazing fight. So here's a question for you then. Would you have rather seen Anderson Silva go down to welterweight to fight GSP, or go up to light heavyweight to fight John Jones?
Ooh, that's interesting. I probably would have rather seen GSP Anderson Silva. I think that the size gap between Anderson Silva and GSP is far less significant than the size gap between Anderson Silva and John Jones, right? Even light heavyweight John Jones, now that he's transitioned to heavyweight, they feel very comfortable talking about how big he is. You don't understand. John Jones was always that big. He's every bit of 6'5", crazy long arms, crazy long legs, and he walked around, according to all accounts, 230, 240, and probably sometimes heavier, right? I mean, Anderson Silva, I've been inside the room with Anderson Silva a few times. Anderson Silva is 210 pounds at his heaviest, when he was in training and in shape. And GSP is probably about 200. So I think from a stylistic standpoint, that would have been really interesting. Now, I've said this many times. I've said this on DAZN MMA. At some point, this sport is going to progress to a level where we're going to get all of these contemporary GOAT debates settled, right? We never get to settle that debate when it comes to Fedor and Randy and Chuck and like that era of guys. They're all retired. They're done. Even if they fought now, you'd say, there's an asterisk next to the results, right? We're never going to get to see Anderson Silva versus GSP. We have to get to a point in the sport where there's a great fighter in one championship, a great fighter in the PFL, a great fighter in the UFC, a great fighter in Bellator, and we got to do the World Cup of MMA or the MMA Olympics or whatever it is, and we're going to crown a real GOAT, an absolute champion. They do it in jiu-jitsu, right? We can do it in the sport of mixed martial arts, because then we wouldn't have to have these top 5 lists. As much fun as they are, Dan, to like try and figure out like who's pound for pound the best fighter in the world right now. Let's actually make these matchups happen. And that GSP Anderson Silva bout could have happened. John Jones, Anderson Silva could have happened.
For sure. So what if we're moving down weight classes? Because I know the one that everyone's screaming at the screen right now is Tony Ferguson against Khabib Nurmagomedov. I mean that was matched, I think, 3 times, and it was either an injury on one side or it just seemed to evade us every time. Now, here's a question for you: do you think people were desperate to see that fight because it kept being matched and falling away? Like, do you think if that fight had never been matched, we'd be as excited to watch Khabib against Ferguson as we would have been against, with Randy against Fedor, for example? Like, do you think it's because we were almost there and we didn't get it, or just because it is a great fight?
I mean, both, right? It is a great fight, but I think that the mystique around it built because we were supposed to get it 3 times, and because the matchup was snake bit, the matchup was cursed, and Tony Ferguson, Khabib Nurmagomedov is never going to happen, because of whatever black magic was working against that bout happening. And maybe like who did that work in the advantage of, right? Did it keep Khabib from being exposed by a guy with like unbelievable scrambling ability and unbelievable takedown defense, and was so dangerous off his back, and a guy that you had to, hit with a 45 and between the eyes if you were going to stop him? Or did it save Tony Ferguson from, being kind of like put in his place as a guy who was an excellent fighter, but not on the same level as someone who's considered one of the GOATs in Khabib Nurmagomedov? Like, that's another reason, for me at least, why that fight is so interesting, because we never got it, and I want to know who benefited most that we didn't get it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, because it's interesting, because I'm less interested in that fight now I've watched Tony Ferguson lose to Oliveira and Dariush, because the way that, certainly the way that Oliveira beat him, I would feel would be the same way that Khabib would have beaten him. And like you look at Makhachev as well, it's the same kind of situation again. He would have been, most likely would have been ironed out and dominated on the floor, which is but I don't know whether I'm making those decisions based on these recent performances, and whether the Tony that would have fought Khabib at that time would have been any more effective. Because I still don't know as he necessarily would have been. But it was always an interesting fight. It's the one that always keeps coming around, that people want to have seen it. I'll be honest, and this is something that maybe we've not talked about, but rematches that never happened. Like, I would have loved to have seen McGregor against Aldo 2. 45, 55, I'm not bothered. But that, for me, I like, although it was an incredible 13 seconds from McGregor, what a performance.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, now what? Like I didn't feel like, I felt like the event had kind of been cancelled almost. My energy had shifted so quickly. Like I would have
Yeah.
loved to have seen that rematch as well. You know, I feel like McGregor capitalized so much on the first encounter with certain fighters that the second one, like look at Poirier for example, capitalized on the first encounter but lost the next two. Like I feel like the second fight, if not different entirely with the result, would have been a certainly a different contest.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because when you talk about rematches like that, right? There's absolutely no reason for the person, whether it's Conor McGregor or not, right? Especially Conor McGregor, but for the reason, the person who knocks you out in 15 seconds or 12 seconds or whatever, there's no reason for them to risk it again because they know, just like we all know, lightning doesn't strike twice, right? You're not going to have that exact same result. You can't improve upon that performance. It's not possible. Can't do it. Can't improve upon a 15-second knockout in the sport of mixed martial arts. So if you're the winner in that case, you're like, I don't want a rematch. And here are all the reasons why I shouldn't have to rematch. They can't even last in there for 30 seconds with me, right? Even though, like, intellectually, we all know that the talent gap isn't so big as that fight made it look. Yeah, that one, I would have loved to have seen it again. That would have been great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, when you think about rematches that or the results of fights, like Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor, if the first fight goes any differently, Nate Diaz's entire life and career is so different, right?
So different. So,
The
so
fact,
different. It was amazing at how he arrived overnight. I mean, people knew of Nate Diaz, but that was him becoming the man that he is today, in my opinion.
yeah, he was a fight fans type star. He wasn't a mainstream star. He wasn't a casual fan star. He was someone that you liked if you were in the sport. You liked if you were actually a mixed martial arts fan. He goes, he beats Conor McGregor, and it's just like, man, it's crazy, right? And then that rematch became a huge deal. And a rematch, everyone needed to see the rematch because we can't believe Nate Diaz beat Conor McGregor, even though people around the sport were like, yeah, it's pretty believable, actually. So, yeah, man, there's, and you know, that the three-peat in that one, or the third edition, is something I absolutely want to see.
Well,
I think
sure,
it's a
there's
fight that makes perfect sense for both.
exactly. I mean, that's another whole another category for is there rubber matches that never happened. Like Bisping against Rockhold. You know, the first time Rockhold choked him out with a one-arm guillotine. Second time Bisping knocked him out with a counter left hook and took the belt off him. Now that is a question. That is a conversation that I'd like to have with Luke Rockhold because I would wonder why he wasn't calling Bisping out for a rematch. Like in his head, was he thinking, I can't lose to Bisping twice. Losing to him once was bad enough. I can't risk losing to him a second time. And then you've got Bisping against Dan Henderson, right? Like now, the first one, Bisping was completely knocked out, knocked unconscious. But then the second one, what was it UFC 204? I could make a strong argument for Dan Henderson winning that one. I would
Yeah,
have been calling for a rematch if I was Dan Henderson, especially because that was a title shot. And I think the first round was like a 10-4 round, the amount of times he knocked him down. Like
yeah.
that's a whole. Maybe we can get some comments from the fans. You know, rubber matches that never happened, but I bet there's some interesting ones. And of course, like McGregor against Diaz has got to be one of the top picks.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've gone down this rabbit hole, right? Leon Edwards says, "Man, I wish I could have had that Jorge Masvidal. Like that's the fight that I want to have." And I think he's still young enough. Masvidal, I think, is maybe going to be done with fights like that. But feasibly, it could happen at some point, right? And a lot of people in the sport are saying, like, I want Francis Ngannou, John Jones. Both of them have said they want it, especially now that Francis is signed with the PFL and John is entrenched with the UFC. It's really highlighted how difficult some of these contract situations are. People want that fight. Okay, let's make the fight happen, right? I mean, the PFL is open to making a fight like that happen. Fans will want it and fans will pay for it, and it can be profitable for everybody. So let's make a fight like that happen. These things, with the way the sport has progressed over the last 25, 30 years, don't have to be radio conversations. They don't have to be podcast conversations. They can be solved, problems that are solved by actually putting people in there to fight. And it's one of the beauties of, you know, the boxing world. As corrupt and strange and fixed as all that business is, like, enough trash talk back and forth, and we're going to get the fights we want to see in boxing. And they're probably going to do some silliness, and they're probably going to shove each other and fight at the weigh-ins and all that. But this is what needs to happen. Like, idle unification in mixed martial arts, I'm all for it.